Hi. Thanks for coming.
Are those some boots or what? My goodness. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you to Susie Merrill, Bob Reeves, everybody who has to do with this amazing program, which is growing in size, reputation, and attendance, I'm happy to say. And thank you, Deborah, for coming out here. She thought it was in Stony Brook, evidently, and she thought she was going to be able to get out here and go back to her small children. But in fact, it's not Stony Brook, and so she's spending the night. So we're just going to talk about basically the New Yorker and fiction, and both sort of in substance in terms of a few stories that I've asked the students to read, but also I think first maybe to talk about process and sort of what goes on in the fiction department now. I will restrain myself from speaking about days of yore because the days of yore are of yore for a reason. And I think most people here are kind of interested in the present and how the New Yorker does what it does with regard to fiction, how it has hung on to fiction and made it a continuingly important part of their publication under pressures that probably mitigate to some extent against that, and how stories end up there. So I'm going to be uncharacteristically quiet, and I'm going to ask Deborah to describe, insofar as she can, the process of the fiction department at the New Yorker, who reads what when, what comes in, how much comes in, and how the final decisions are made.
Okay, and next week I'll interview you about the days of yore.
That's fine. Just read my book coming out in November. You'll find out.
Well, the fiction department consists of myself and two other full-time editors and one part-time editor who's Roger Angel, who's been there for about 60 years and also can talk about the days of yore. And all of us also edit nonfiction. So our days are pretty packed. It's like one of those Venn diagrams where there are people who edit only nonfiction, but then the fiction editors sort of overlap with that circle. We are sent an enormous amount of material, as you can imagine. And our what has traditionally been called the slush pile is virtual these days, which makes it slightly less oppressive than when we had a whole closet full of mail, post office boxes full of paper. It's also easier to kind of forget that it's there. And we have one problem, which we didn't have before, which is that our spam filter sort of automatically deletes anything that seems slightly racy. So some writers just really can't get their stories through to us. That's we get all these irate letters. But it happens to Junot Diaz all the time. I mean, basically every story of his is blocked, and we've had to, resort to Gmail and so on.
Haven't they learned to use asterisks then?
It seems sort of crazy that this spam filter is, censoring us, but apparently if they take it away, then Armageddon ensues. And basically, so we're all reading material all the time, which comes in all kinds of ways. It can come in directly from writers. It comes in from agents. It comes in from publishers. It comes in from friends of writers. It comes in from teachers of writing students. And it all sort of sits in our inboxes or on our desks for varying periods of time, which sometimes have absolutely nothing to do with anything, just when your eye happens to fall on something. And we try to get things turned around at a reasonable rate, but it's not always very reasonable if you're waiting, with bated breath. And anything that any of us reads that we think is worth considering or taking seriously or discussing gets circulated to everybody else. And once a week we sit down and talk about those stories. So we usually have anywhere between 8 and 20 stories circulating at any time that we're all thinking about and looking at. And we have these meetings where we disagree a lot, which is great. If this were just one person doing this job, I think you'd find yourself in constant paroxysms of self-doubt, whereas if other people are disagreeing with you, you defend your position, and it feels more defensible. And some of the stories, it's an obvious, yes, we need to do this. This is great. Some of them, it's an obvious, it just doesn't really work. Maybe there's something there, but this story's not going to work. And then the sort of majority of them are between those two. And we spend a lot of time talking about what could be done to make these stories better, and often engage in discussions with the writers about revisions. That's pretty much our process. The stories themselves go through a wide range of transformations between the time that we get them and the time they come out in the magazine. Some of them really just have, quite minor line edits and copy edits done, and some of them will be entirely rewritten or chopped in half. It all depends on the story, and it depends on the relationship with the writer that develops. And, some writers sort of view us as, we're first readers, and they're very welcoming to a response, even if it's negative, because they want to make the stories as good as they can. So my experience with editing has been not one of battle and struggle, but mostly one of collaboration, which I'm grateful for. Every now and then there's a battle, but you start to learn who are the writers who aren't going to accept any criticism, and you think, well, if this person sends me a story that isn't quite working, I'm just not going to take it because he's not going to fix it. So I suppose it comes back to bite them in the end, but usually it's a really pleasant process, and it's one that where you build relationships with writers and get a huge thrill out of being helpful to them in whatever ways that we can.
And the final decision?
David Remnick, who's the editor-in-chief, has to sign off on any stories, and every now and then he'll veto something that I would like to do, but mostly he pretty much sees eye to eye with our opinions.
How many stories do you get every week that you and your colleagues think are worth considering?
Well, like I said, we have between, I said 8 and 20. It's usually an average, I'd say, of 12 stories that we have going around at any given time.
I'm just wondering whether there has been, out of a kind of curiosity, not about but about comparative whether you all have in the last 3, 4, 5 years considered fiction of greater length than you generally publish. In other words, going back to the idea of a novella or a double part piece.
Yeah, we haven't done any 2-part fiction pieces in a long time. If anything, we're trending towards having less space in the magazine than we used to. But that's simply, everything is trending towards having less space in print because of what happened to advertising a few years ago.
It's not only that, I think, but also books. In the last 10 years, books have become shorter.
Yeah.
They just have. I mean, not much shorter, but if you take the 150,000 trade books that are books that are published, you look at them 10 years ago, they tend to be shorter now.
And do you think this has to do with attention span?
I do.
Yeah.
I think, yeah. So on the way over, we were talking about your podcast, which seemed in some ways, from your description of it, to sort of be an invigorating and a kind of refreshing change for you all. Can you talk a little bit about the statistics and the reception?
Well, I do a monthly podcast in which I ask a current fiction writer who's been published in the magazine to choose any story by somebody else from the archives of the magazine. So they have, almost 90 years of fiction to choose from. And then that person reads the story aloud and we discuss it for, a half hour or so, or a little less. And I've been doing this now, I think tomorrow I'm taping number 72. So it's been...
With whom?
Richard Ford. Yeah. He'll be reading a Harold Brodsky story.
Really?
Yep.
That'd be interesting.
In fact, Harold Brodsky's first story.
Really?
The State of Grace. Yeah. So I do this every month, and it it started off just as a kind of a fun idea and a way of, we were thinking of ways to expand what we do online and ways to expand what we do, in digital editions of the magazine and so on. And fiction, of course, lends itself to audio because, as we've discovered, people like to be read to. We also, every week, have the writer of the story come in and read it aloud or go to a studio and read it aloud, and we release that reading with our iPad edition.
What if they're at some distant distance?
They go to a studio near them.
Somewhere.
Yeah. And some of the podcasts are done remotely. I'm in New York and they're in another place. So the podcast goes out, and it goes out on our website, and it goes out through iTunes, and you can subscribe, and it's free. And the response to this has been sort of overwhelmingly wonderful for me, because we put out fiction in the magazine every week, and my experience in the last 15 years has been that if somebody really likes a story, he or she will tell their friends, I really like this story in the New Yorker, you should read it. If somebody is really bothered by a story or upset by it, then they write to me and complain. So most of the responses I get tend to be negative, or else they're pointing out, factual errors, where they think they've caught out the legendary New Yorker fact-checking department. So the response that I get back for the work that I do on a weekly basis tends not to be all that heartwarming. I assume that there are people out there who are enjoying the stories, but I don't always hear from them. So the podcast, I think perhaps because the sort of aspect of sour grapes has been removed. These are stories from the past. Any judgment calls have already been made. I didn't turn down your story in order to have this one. People have just really responded to this, and they've really seemed to have enjoyed the discussions and the readings. And the podcast is now built up to where it's getting between 200 and 250,000 downloads every month.
When Deborah said that in the car, I thought 250 to 300 downloads. I sort of went ahead to that. Didn't even
You're like,
wait.
Oh, that's nice.
I
Nice
didn't
little
even
project for you.
I didn't even wait to hear 1,000. I mean, it was very impressive and very heartening, actually.
It's very heartening. It tells me that people like fiction, and that there is really an audience for it. Because we don't actually have much data on who reads the fiction on a weekly basis. The magazine goes out. We don't know what you guys read in it. Maybe you just look at the cartoons, like everyone says. Maybe you just look at
Well, the
Talk of the
cartoons
Town.
and the fiction evidently have something very strong in common, which is that everybody kind of immediately hates them, and then loves them later on.
Loves them in retrospect.
Yes.
Yeah. So things that came out 20 years ago seem much better than they did at the time.
If I may, I'll tell you a story about Harold Brodsky. Harold Brodsky was in my office once and told me he had sex with Marilyn Monroe. And I said, "Oh, Harold." And he got very upset about ever having his word questioned. And I realized his face was beginning to knot up in fury. And he said, you don't believe me, do you? And I was scared. He's a scary guy. And I said, "Oh, no, I do. And then I sort of tried to save myself. I said, "How was it?" And he said, "It's not that much fun to have sex with someone who has much more sexual confidence than you do." So then I began to believe him, actually.
I'll be sure to mention that in the podcast.
Well, tell me, if you can, the sort of, you talked about the weekly meetings where you discuss what's in and what's out. How, within the bounds of gentility, how rancorous do they get? I mean, do people get steamed sometimes?
Every now and then there's a little outburst. If one person thinks something is fantastic and everybody else in the room is saying you're crazy, it can generate, some wounded pride. I tend not to get very upset. I don't know if that's just my nature. I sort of feel like, oh, maybe I like something, everybody else thinks it's awful. Okay. It's just, that's my taste, and I'll bow to the majority. And if I really hate something and everybody else in the room thinks it's fantastic, I don't stand in its way. I just say I'm not the right reader for this voice. So, Roger. Roger can get quite worked up about things, but we also sort of have forced him to acknowledge that if we only published the stories he liked, we'd need to be quarterly.
Well, we don't
So-
want that to happen, that's for sure. Do you have written opinions still?
Yeah, we still do. So everyone, as they read the stories, will write just a paragraph of their immediate response to that story, and sometimes it's an opinion. Sometimes it's what suggestions they would have for revision. And these things circulate before the meeting. So usually we go into the meeting with a fair idea of how the discussion's going to go. In your day, you didn't have discussions. It
No,
was just
we
all on
had
paper,
it
right?
was all on paper.
Yeah, and it was still that way when I started, and about 15 years ago, and how people would circulate the paper copy. Now it's all by email. It's very easy to circulate a story. In fact, when somebody sends us something on paper, it's distressing. You got to Xerox this thing, and our Xerox machines are just permanently broken down. Like no one uses them anymore, so they sit there with red lights flashing for months at a
But
time.
you all have printers.
We all have printers, but if somebody sends you something on paper, how do you print it?
Right.
You've got to
There's
scan
that.
it.
There's that.
Then you've got to get an intern to go and scan it and teach an intern how to use the scanner and so on. I do remember my very first job in publishing when I was 17. Was I 17? Yeah. 17 or 18.
10 years ago.
Exactly. Thank you. Maybe 11. I remember the boss asking me to fax something to someone.
Fax.
Right. That's what I thought.
Who knew?
So I typed up an envelope and took this letter into him to sign. And I thought maybe he'd just said FedEx very fast. And he said, "Deborah, you do know you don't need an envelope with faxes, right?" So I feel often with interns.
What was that job?
I was working at a very small publishing company in Vancouver, Canada, in my sort of summer after my, I guess, freshman year in college.
And then what for you?
And then what?
And then college.
Finished college. And I worked for my first year or so after college at the Three Penny Review. Mm-hmm. I was in Berkeley, and I was Wendy Lesser, who's been the editor and founder of the Three Penny Review for its entire lifespan. She had never had an assistant before, so I was her first assistant. And at first she didn't quite know what to do with me, and she taught me some very useful things about reading and editing, but she also taught me when you do direct mail campaigns that you can use a sponge and you can seal 5 envelopes at once.
Oh my God.
You line them up and then you close them.
Crucial.
So
Those days are over too.
Those days are over. Yeah.
No more
yeah.
sponges. The market has gone way down for sponges.
So after that, I did an internship at Harper's Magazine. I moved to New York.
Who was at Harper's doing fiction then?
Fiction was kind of open to any of the editors, but it was a great staff. It was Michael Pollan was there, and I was specifically working for him. And Jairus Khan and Paul Tuff, Colin Harrison, Elena Silverman.
That's distinguished.
And Rob Boynton.
And then?
And then I worked for a time at the New York Review of Books and left there to edit a quarterly called Grand Street, which doesn't exist now, but was art, poetry, fiction, quarterly, sort of in the same zone, somewhat as Granta. And it was a place that was run by a wonderful woman called Jean Stein, who her only flaw was that she didn't know better than to hire a 23-year-old to run her magazine. So
Wait, you'd done all that other stuff before 23? Oh, wow. Okay.
So
Scary.
I went in and sort of had to learn on the fly how to do everything there, and that was a great experience. So I was there for 4 years, and then I wanted to, I'd learned what I was going to learn, and I wanted to expand to a bigger audience. And so I started hounding Bill Buford, who was the fiction editor at that point, for a job at the New Yorker. And he sort of hemmed and hawed for a while and didn't have anything, and then finally brought me on. And then 5 years later, he left, and I got his job.
There you go. And Bob's your uncle, as I used to say to Bob Gottlieb. tell me about, I know, let me be a little provocative and say that I know people who submit to the New Yorker under foreign names. You must know this. One person I know submits stories to the New Yorker under the name of her Croatian cleaning lady.
Has it gotten her anywhere?
You published her a few weeks ago. No, I'm just kidding. She's gotten some offers for cleaning, for apartment cleaning, but otherwise not. So my question is how, I guess it's really not provocative. How aware are you of being now an international publisher of fiction? I mean, you personally and the magazine. There are, as you know, grievances from some American writers that there's a preference for foreign writers that is clear. That's why we have Croatian cleaning ladies. But there also seems to be a spirit of internationalism that, to me, wasn't so present in years before you.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you say that because we actually do very little fiction in translation, which is something I would love us to do more of. But we're in a position where I only read one foreign language, and the people I work with don't read foreign languages. So our ability to really research and explore what's being published in other languages is limited. So in that zone, we're reliant on translators, on what they're working on, and on the book publishing industry for what's being, who's paying someone to translate things. So there isn't a whole lot of actual foreign fiction. What you are seeing more of, and what people are maybe complaining about, is immigrant fiction. Writers from other places who've moved to the U.S. And who write in English and have, or might even be second generation immigrants. So I actually don't.
Not Junot Diaz, because he doesn't get through the spam, right? So you don't see.
We've had to set up a whole email account just for Juno. Right. Well, I mean, he's an immigrant from the Dominican Republic. He came as a kid. I mean, a lot of the people with funny names that you see have actually lived in the U.S. for a long time, and I don't really think of them so much as foreign, though they have a wealth of experience in other countries to draw on when they're writing. So I think it's perhaps true. It's definitely true in England. If you look at the last week or just announced Granta's Best of Young British Writers, and they said 12 of them have come from other countries.
Right.
But they are living in Britain. They are writing in English, right. and so these are. I don't actually, in my mind, put that in the category of foreign fiction.
I should have asked the question differently, and I hope I knew that and should have posed it in a different way. So let me pose it again. Do you have consciously in your mind, and do your colleagues have in mind, a desire for and a hope for a more international sense of what you're doing in fiction and well, maybe poetry, but do you want to see more global sense in an active, abstract way?
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying makes sense, and I suppose it would be nice to really have a global picture of what we want in the magazine. I feel we don't really have that. What we have is a response to stories one by one, and it may just be that what we see as the most vibrant writing happening right now is often being produced by people with more global experience. But I think if you actually look week by week, you'll find plenty of purebred Mayflower Americans. And what I find funny is people, occasionally we will get a sort of irate letter saying, would it kill you to publish a story by a white male American, once in a while, just once, And I think, my God, I mean, look around. We've done so many, but there's something of a perception that we turn down one thing to get another thing, and that never happens.
Right.
We have 50 fiction slots a year. It's very hard to find 50 really good stories in a year. Monthlies find 12. It's, as you know, there's a lot of pressure. I mean, when you were there were even more. There's a lot of pressure to find 50 good stories. We never turn down anything that seems good enough. So, well, I would love to build up a huge bank of Americans and
It's funny.
foreigners.
It's funny because I, I read quarterlies a lot, and because I went to a gala for the Paris Review, I was reading their fiction recently, and I read 3 stories there that I thought could have been anywhere. I'm not going to go to your complaint bureau and say, why didn't you publish so and so? But it seems to me maybe it could be that as a reader rather than as an editor, my standards are a little different, not looser, but I'm just more interested in the idea of reading a different story. Maybe if I had to be selective about it, it would be different. But my sense is that partly because of MFA programs and partly because of a continuing and perhaps inexplicable desire for people to write fiction, short or otherwise, that there is a lot of good stuff. So I'm somewhat surprised to hear you say that it's hard to find 50 things that are good enough. You must turn down things that, 3 years earlier or 3 years later, someone else would have published. But that's...
Or 1 week later.
Or 1 week later,
Yeah. That happens all the time. The whole world of fiction is completely subjective. And I might respond to something that someone else wouldn't. And, stories that have run in the New Yorker might be turned down by the Paris Review. So that's just a matter of sort of individual response, I think, really. But yes, there's a huge sort of outpouring of writers from MFA programs. And that has been the one thing I think that has kept the short story form alive, because the pressure in the publishing industry leans towards novels. So
not so much anymore. Interestingly,
it's shifting.
In the last few years,
shifting in the last few years. It is.
So take heart.
But the short story form is the easiest form to handle in a class, because you can encompass it in a class. So that has been the one thing that's really kept the influx of material. But often, the writers directly out of an MFA program, maybe we feel they're still not quite formed, or they haven't written the perfect story yet. So I think it is a challenge to find 50 good stories, and we're never going to find 50 stories that everybody likes.
No. Have you developed any sort of? You said it's very subjective. I might subjectively disagree with that, but have you found any standards or ideas that you have when you read a story yourself that are sort of criteria? I mean, can you describe, or is it a perfectly natural response to the narrative that you happen to be reading? I mean, do you have any sort of things that you tick off?
I don't have a checklist. No. I mean, it's really the way that I would express it to myself is that I look for a story that's fulfilling its own ambitions. So if somebody is trying to write something that's sort of all about voice, like a George Saunders, if that voice becomes credible and that voice takes over and you want to keep reading it, then it's succeeded. If someone wants to write a very traditional sort of narrative about, personal relations, say an Alice Munro or a Jhumpa Lahiri, if those stories work, they work. I just think each piece has to kind of work on its own terms. And it's not that assessment, I think, is subjective sometimes. Right. It's not, I know this because I go into a room with 4 other people every week and we disagree. So it is subjective, but I think, I'm not looking for a story to do one particular thing. I'm looking for a story to do what it's setting out to do.
And you're not interested, speaking of Saunders and others of his ilk, if there is such an ilk, you're not looking. I remember I asked Scott Turow for a quote for a book I was publishing once, and he was very cranky with me. He said, if I even answered such questions from you and your ilk, and I thought he said elk at first, because I didn't want to hear ilk, right? But then he was very nice after that, I will say.
Yeah.
But are you aware of being modernistic? I mean, in other words, do you have feelings about old-fashionedness versus, let's say, newfangledness?
I have feelings. I have deep feelings, but but
Because you said you,
would I prefer a George Saunders to a William Trevor? Say,
Yeah.
not necessarily. I feel William Trevor can do what William Trevor does, and he can do it well. Someone imitating William Trevor and not quite doing it is usually a disaster.
Right.
And so is
And
someone
Saunders.
imitating Saunders and not quite doing it.
Disaster, maybe.
So really, it's a matter of being a genius at what you do. To write that down.
Actually, I have lots of things written down here. Can you talk about, I don't know how many people here have read the stories. Can you raise your hands that if anyone has read the stories that were circulated? Not that many.
He's great. Thank you.
In that case, I think I won't dwell in detail on them, but I will ask some questions in particular about is it Will Mackin? Mm-hmm. Because that was a kind of slightly phenomenal, almost news-making story, which you don't see that often.
Yeah.
This is a story by a Navy SEAL
He's
team.
a Navy aviation specialist.
Navy aviation specialist about a war in the Middle East. And how did it get to you? And how did he become that good a writer? Has he written before?
Yeah. George Saunders enters into that story, actually. Will Mackin
entering
is
into everything.
Yeah, he's he's in his 40s, I think. That was his first published story since he was in his early 20s. He's been in the Navy, and he's been posted to Iraq and Afghanistan, and along with other places. And while in Afghanistan, he worked with SEAL Team 6. He was not with them for the Bin Laden raid, but he was with them in Afghanistan, and that's what that particular story is about. And throughout this time, I mean, when he was in college, he wanted to be a writer, and he had sort of.
Where's he from?
Where did he grow? I'm not quite sure where he grew up. I think maybe in New Jersey, actually. Oh. He lives now in New Mexico. I think originally New Jersey, and he had sort of enlisted, and then gotten into a writing program or something. And he went to his teacher, and he said, "Well, what should I think I'm going to drop the Navy." And the teacher said, "Absolutely don't. Go have something to write about. Go have some experience." And it was, luckily, because he's still alive and safe, it was the right decision for him, I think. But he was sort of writing all along and keeping notebooks, and he's now teaching or training Navy recruitment or something in New Mexico, and he's started really writing in earnest, and he's gone to a few writing classes. And at some point, I think in the summer literary seminars, which is a program I visited, which used to happen in St. Petersburg and now in Lithuania, he met George Saunders, who was speaking there, and George was very encouraging about his writing and has kind of stayed in touch with him. And this particular story, George was a huge fan of, and he sent it to me. And
how many of the pieces that appear in the New Yorker, I think that you said in your introductory remarks that I think you implied or it sort of emanated from them that they have intermediaries often, the ones that do appear, which is only natural. I just wonder how many utterly raw, unexpected things happen. Mm-hmm. But if George Saunders sends you something, and if he had sent me something, I would have paid attention to it.
He's sent me many things I've also turned down, by students. But there was a pre-screening process with that particular story.
And there usually is.
There often is, yeah. I mean, what you're asking indirectly is how often do we take something from the slush pile that's completely unconnected to anything? And
you got me.
The answer is not very often. Which
it's interesting because Saunders came from the slush pile.
Yeah.
He was read by David McCormick first, who was my assistant.
He wasn't with Esther yet?
No.
What's happened, and this is part of the sort of rise of the MFA program, is that people take writing classes and they're told they have to get an agent first, and whereas I think maybe even as recently as 20 years ago, you could sort of be writing on your own and submitting your stories. now you're fed into a system where you're educated about this process and told to do things in a certain order. What also happens is that there's been a rise of the debut novelist and the debut writer, and suddenly how the people who used to be published quite quietly have been making a splash, and agents are desperate to have the next exciting new writer on their roster. So agents are very proactive about this. They go out to all the writing programs, they scour the journal. You publish a story in a journal and it catches an agent's eye, and they'll approach you. So there's been a sort of takeover of the process. So what that means is that the quality of the manuscripts in the slush pile has gone down. It's gone down in the time that I've been looking at slush piles.
It couldn't be worse than it was.
There are fewer. There are
worse.
fewer gems. There are fewer George Saunders
that
in there.
I can understand, but
I mean, there's a basic level, but so it is quite rare that something comes directly from the slush pile into the pages of the magazine, though it has happened while I've been there. What's more likely to happen is that someone reads a story in slush that has some promise, that has a voice, passes that along to, the slush is read by our interns, who are actually all MFA students.
That's hard. And most of the MFA students are interns. I think
and they pass along a fair amount of things. They might pass along 3 or 4 stories in a day, and those are read by one of
3 or 4 in a day. Oh my God,
they get through a lot.
I
mean, it depends. And so those are read by one of the editors, and if there's really something there, but the story's, it's not quite good enough, that writer will get a personal response and will then know this particular editor and will send their next story to that particular editor. So a correspondence will start up, and that happens fairly frequently. And we might not take the next story, we might take a story 5 stories down the road, and by that time, perhaps the writer actually will have signed up with an agent, perhaps they won't. But the slush pile can start a relationship if there's something promising in there.
What about the complaints that I hear? This will be my last question. About
it's all
complaints.
It's all about complaints.
I've in preparation for talking to you, I have been reading your fiction, to give you that credit, which you deserve, more assiduously than I have in a year or two, and it's really good. It's really, really good. However, I will say that no real qualifications. The complaint is that about response time, and this even from published writers who may feel that they have a reason to think that they should hear sooner than they do, even allowing for the fact that all writers think they ought to hear within 3 minutes about what they've done, especially if they are as full of themselves as some writers can be. Allowing for that, is there, can you respond to the idea of what the response time is like and why? And this is for people who are of some, achievement, some accomplishment.
Mm-hmm. You mean, but not the slush pile?
Not the slush pile.
Who have you been talking to?
I'm not telling, because I think if I told you, you'd probably never publish them.
Yeah, it can be slow. It's often, if you saw my inbox, you would know I'm always, I haven't read for personal pleasure in 15 years.
That's the question I was going to ask you. Actually, I'm glad you said that.
We're always, all of us, wading through huge stacks of stuff because there just is a lot to read, and because we see most things. So sometimes it's slower than it should be, but it's and every now and then it's a matter of sort of us having to get together and come to a decision and talk about what to suggest for the story that maybe needs a revision. So things can move slowly, but it doesn't tend to be. I don't think it tends to be that slow.
I think it tends to be what I said, sort of preparatorily, which is that writers work alone.
They want an instant response,
and they want a quick response.
What was the response time in your day? Back in your.
Well, it's interesting. have serious OCD in that regard, and I was doing the administration of the department and sort of running the schedules and doing the magazine award nominations and stuff like that. So I was de facto doing some of the things that you do, and it was quicker. In general.
What does that mean?
I'll tell you what it means. If depending on the
Because you don't know how quick it can be for us.
I only know from the complainants, not from the wonderful
Okay, maybe it was
successes.
only slow for this one particular griper. Was it Harold Bronke?
When we had a submission from someone who had been in the magazine, someone we'd encouraged, someone from an agent, someone who'd been recommended by somebody like George, someone who had come to our attention through the very channels that you're describing, we tried to get back within a month.
That's totally in keeping with what
Very
we would
good.
do
Then
now.
it's just this sour.
Maybe there was one person that
this
had a
sour
really bad
grape.
experience. But
It was a sour
yeah.
grape that no is. I'm just curious. I mean, you must have heard. I can't believe you haven't heard complaints. It's like saying, it's the same thing as with the cartoons and the fiction in general. You hold an estimable place. You hold a place of great respect and renown, and therefore you're going to get more brickbats, no matter how conscientious you are. So I'm not joining this chorus. I promise you.
All right.
So let's talk about, just for a minute, even though no one has read them except for 2 or 3 supremely excellent
This man over here.
students. I want to talk about, there's a story by Tessa Hadley, who's British, I think. There's a story by Ruth Parajavala. She died shortly after this was published. Is that correct?
Yes. Yep.
Was she able to work on the story?
Yeah, I had worked on the story with her, and in fact,
piece.
it had almost gone to press, and then it had to move a couple of issues later. But so the story had been fully worked on with her. She was at the time that she went into the hospital. She was working on the Q&A that we do with the fiction writers for the website, and then she couldn't finish that and felt bad about it. She went into the hospital with an infection, and it was about a month later that she died. Yeah. It was her daughters very much wanted the story to come out while she was alive, and we made sure that happened.
How old was she?
She was 85.
And how heavy was the editing? Did you work with her?
Yeah. I mean, there's
moderate.
I don't know what, sort of like.
Did you move stuff around?
I don't know what your standards are for moderate or heavy, but yes, things were moved around. There were some, probably about 500 to 800 words were cut. I mean, there's a lot of just tinkering with sentences, but she was very up for that always.
It's a wonderful piece, and I mean, so is the Tessa Hadley. The Tessa Hadley is.
Though in the car on the way here, you referred to Tessa Hadley as kudzu.
Yeah, well, I've just seen.
Maybe you can explain that remark.
Someone told me that it was her middle name, so I was just asking. No, I've seen a lot of Tessa. I think I've seen a lot of Tessa Hadley.
You have, actually.
Unless I'm mistaken.
You have. She's a really reliable short story writer.
So we have Tessa Hadley, Ruth Parajavala, and then we have the person, wonderful writer, whose name that you will pronounce for me.
Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie.
And there you go, otherwise known as Jimmy. And then in this selection, we have Will Mackin, the sort of war person. And then at the end, we have a kind of a story called Marjorie Lemke about a room cleaner in a motel, I believe, who has an affair with the guy who's staying there, whose wife is off traveling, I think.
She's busting unions.
And the author's name is Sarah Bronstein. This is not a first publication for her?
It's her first time in the magazine. Yeah, she's published a few stories.
Tell me a little bit about her and how she got to you.
We've seen stories of hers a few times, and in fact, the last story of hers came very close and didn't quite make it in the end. She's just a very talented young writer. I don't know her personally.
Is she an MFA person? Do you know about
You know,
her?
I don't know much about her at all, except
Did it
that we
come to
like her
you?
writing. No, it came to Willing Davidson, who's a senior editor in the department, and he's championed her work. And I think she's maybe around 30. I'm not sure exactly, but
What's
just a very
interesting-
good writer.
what's
And that one
interesting-
actually went through 2 or 3 revisions.
I can see. I mean, I can't tell that, but
yeah.
I can feel, especially at the ending of that story,
Especially at the ending, it
that
went through
there
some
were
revisions. Yeah.
probably
Yeah.
some questions raised and answered.
Yeah.
So I chose these stories for chronological proximity to this event. And so I got this general sense of this global, that happened to be that they were Indian and African and
Ruth, she writes about India, but she's German originally. Ruth Chapala.
right. Is she not ethnically Indian?
No,
at
she
all?
married an Indian. Her name is Ruth Prower.
Ruth Prower.
but
Okay.
Chapala is her
Okay.
husband's name.
Writing about India.
Yeah,
All
she
right.
lived
So
there
she's
for a long
German.
time.
Germany, India. You know. I stand corrected and somewhat embarrassed.
David also made that mistake, so you're not alone.
And
I think some people, until her obituary came out, assumed that she herself was Indian, because it's been the major subject of her fiction.
and has been and was even when I was there. So it's been a long
And she's
storied
been
history.
publishing in the magazine since 1957.
Wow. And then the Tessa Hadley from across the pond, and then the Bronstein, is that the way you say her name?
Yeah.
Story, which seems to me, it's interesting that I happen to pick these 4 or 5 things because they have that feeling. Even the Will Mackin story has a feeling of not America in a way.
So it's Americans in Afghanistan.
It's but it's in Afghanistan. And then we get the motel story, which I recommend to you because it feels almost old-fashioned. And I say that in the best way. It also feels very hermetic because it is sort of set in the motel and it doesn't really go very far away from it. So it was interesting to feel the lens of the magazine sort of going way out and then sort of coming a little closer and then coming way into the thing. But each of these stories has been chosen simply on what you all consider to be its own merit. There's no
absolutely.
no program.
Yep.
Since many of you haven't read these stories, I won't go into the detail about them that I was going to ask Deborah. And since you may have questions, I think I'm going to stop and ask you what you'd like to ask Deborah that I haven't covered, which is many things. Yes.
For literature written in languages other than English, how do these come to you? How do you learn?
What's the last translated piece you did?
So the question is how do translated stories come to us? How do we learn about it? For the most part, through translators. I also maintain relationships with foreign publishers who will tell me when there's a new writer on their radar who's doing stories, and we'll sometimes have something translated just to send to us. But it's limited. My hands are sort of tied by a larger industry around me that has to be supporting that writer. We did a few years ago, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, we did an international fiction issue, and really very actively were seeking out stories from other countries that maybe hadn't, by writers who maybe hadn't been translated before. And I'll tell you my dirty secret about that is that I read French, and the French translate everything. They're wonderful. So I was reading Albanian and Japanese writers in French, deciding if I thought the stories worked, and then having them translated from the original language. So there were a number of, there's a Japanese writer, Yoko Ogawa, who hadn't really been translated or published in the US before, but I had actually been reading her in French for a long time because the French were very good at translating her, and I was a big fan of her work. So that was one way that happened, but I don't, it doesn't happen that much. I don't usually have time.
The skill of a translator is more vital in poetry.
Yeah.
You're not stuck with a
Yeah, yeah. We have some very good translators that we've worked with over the years whom we trust. But it can definitely happen, and that often happens if, say, an agent in Spain wants to show us something, and they just have someone who really isn't a fluent translator send it to us, and then we can't assess, we can't really judge.
Someone else? Yeah, in the back.
Can you talk about your creative process as an editor?
That's an interesting question. It's so instinctive. I can't talk about. Actually, it is instinctive. I mean, I usually sit the first step is to think about whether I'm asking someone to revise something before I sort of go in and start mucking about. So then there's often a phase of just talking to a writer about a story and where I think something might need something more from that writer. Then there's a phase where really I try to just be immersed in a story, and whether I'm doing it by hand or actually in the computer changing things, I'm trying to come up with. The way I feel about it is that it's very important as an editor not to try to insert or enforce your own voice on a story, but that what you're trying to do is to find the voice of the story and find the places where that voice has been sort of submerged, or where the writer has become distracted from it or hasn't sort of, and bring it to the surface more. So that's the sort of conscious thinking about it. But how that comes out in what I would suggest doing to a sentence is a little bit harder to describe.
What about content? What about narrative content? I mean, that is to say, not voice, not manner, not style, but do you often, or do you all often suggest that someone in the story do X rather than Y?
It happens occasionally, but it's rarely that prescriptive. It's more, this character isn't doing something, and this character needs to do something. And it's not, this character needs to do X. Right. So it's more, we're sensing a lack, or we're sensing that this ending is very unsatisfying, or so-and-so has disappeared and maybe needs to come back. But it's not, it's rare that I would actually say something very concrete. But, it does happen. Right. It does happen when there's something that seems obvious.
There was I don't know if it still exists, but there was a sort of myth about the New Yorker fiction editing process, which was that everybody could expect to have his or her last paragraph cut.
It's interesting.
Is that still
that comes up? I mean, actually, you could also say the same thing about the first paragraph, because often there's a lot of throat clearing that goes on when people sit down to write.
And at the end, there's a lot of telling of what has been shown.
Overstating. Yeah, I mean, you're getting into the sort of classical view of the New Yorker story is very vague and open-ended and so on. But I never believed that, except for the stories. I mean, how often did you chop the last paragraph?
Often.
Yeah.
Not infrequently, or at least the last few sentences. It's fairly, because the writer had already done the work.
Yeah, it's fairly frequent that the ending is the focus of what you do as an editor. That's where the writers.
Yes.
How about memoir? Is that another department?
It's not another department, but sort of everybody at the New Yorker could conceivably edit a memoir. So, we see a lot of them in the fiction department. We tend to see that maybe the more literary ones, but it crosses the board for all of the editors.
What's the last part of a memoir you all published? I don't recall. Do you?
I'm not sure. Okay. I'd have to look. Yeah.
Does anybody know? Yeah. Yes. The gentleman who read the stories.
Yes.
I'm curious, given your obvious love for stories or compulsion to read, what drove you to go into editing at a young age as opposed to writing?
Right.
And also, it sounds like you've worked in group editor groups for a while. Is that an environment that you find sufficiently stimulating that you want to stay there long term, or in your future, would you want to be working with an individual author or smaller group just on your own?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's everybody's dream to have their own, I would love to edit the New Yorker entirely by myself. That would be great. Though then I would take a really long time to respond to submissions. No, I do like the group thing. As I said, I really like disagreeing. I really like hearing other people's responses to stories and understanding that mine is not the only possible one. and especially when they're people whose judgment I trust. So I like that situation. Why I didn't become a writer, I was never really inclined to be a fiction writer, and I think in order to be a fiction writer, you really have to be convinced that you have something to write about and that you have something that's going to make the world a better place and all of that. I didn't have that conviction. I did have a conviction that I was pretty good at fixing things, and working with raw material that came to me and making it stronger. So that was what I pursued. Yeah.
Yes, in the blue shirt next to the gentleman who read the story.
I read one of the stories,
Which one?
the Menaker,
Oh, great.
because it reminded me of the pugilist at rest.
Mm-hmm.
That is, I wrote that down this afternoon when I
on his
when I
notes.
reread it. It very much like The Pugilist at Rest, which was actually a controversial story when it was first published. And in fact, it was first called Hey Baby. And
Interesting.
talking with Tom Jones, we got him to change it. I mean, I'm glad. I think The Pugilist at Rest is the better title, but working with him was tremendous fun. Anyway, I'm so glad you mentioned that story. Probably one of the proudest moments that I've had is the publication of that story. Very prescient. Now that you look back and you look at the Will Mack and other things, a very sort of almost, vision of the future and a kind of American military voice that was good early on, as were many Vietnam accounts, actually, come to think of it. Anyway, go ahead.
The question. Yeah.
What was my question?
Yes.
You mentioned before the declining quality of the slush pile, and having read submissions for the Southampton Review, one thing I've noticed is a problem with young writers, novice writers, is mostly structure. Would you say in your experience that is largely the problem, narrative structure, and do you see this as a growing trend in the industry of?
I don't know. I think the issue with the slush pile, there are two issues I would bring up. And one is, from my experience working at a much smaller magazine that was a quarterly, where we got a lot of slush, most of that slush was coming from people who had read the magazine and had some awareness of its particular specialty and its sort of where it was positioned, and were aiming generally in that direction themselves. The New Yorker gets everything. I mean, it's the one magazine that most people who want to write a story have heard of. So there's no sort of filter there. So, we get a lot of sort of stories about how cute someone's kid is and a lot of that. So there's
Do you have any categories that are more difficult to overcome the way, in fact, we used
there's
to?
cute kids and death of a parent. I mean, those are the
Can't-
first sexual experiences.
Putting
Three things everyone has to write about.
putting old people in a nursing home?
We haven't had so much of that. There was a period where I kept getting stories about clowns. I mean, every now and then you notice like these sort of things popping up over and over.
Trending.
There was
as
a
they
period
say.
where there was constant pedophilia. It's like it's odd. It's odd. Things go in phases with fiction. But
we had a lot of cancer stories, and that was
yes,
another.
a lot of cancer stories.
That was another.
But that's a subcategory of death of a parent.
Right.
Yes.
Right. That's a bar that had to be cleared, but all those bars were occasionally cleared.
Yeah,
I mean,
of course. Look at Laurie Moore.
Exactly.
I mean, you can do anything. You can do death of a parent fantastically well. I mean, we had a great Colm Toy-Bean story about the death of a mother. I mean, but yes, there's a higher bar because the story has been written many times.
Right.
So it has to be done. I mean, I think it's interesting what you're saying about narrative structure. I don't know if I haven't personally pinpointed that as the issue, but I'm also not reading the slush on a daily basis.
In my experience with just reading fiction in general, when you're dealing with stuff that's of high quality, the narrative structure is usually there. It has more to do with what Deborah was talking about: consistency, voice, maybe places where you can tell that the writer hasn't sustained a certain thing that you think the writer probably wanted to sustain.
I think it's also, there's a slight problem in that so many people have taken writing classes and have achieved a level of competence so that you have vast numbers, hundreds of stories a year that are very competent. where you can't really say, well, you didn't manage to do that, you know, but they just don't quite have a spark that makes them stand out or surprise you in any way. So it's not that, you know, every story has to have a clown, but there's a certain sort of flatness I find to the slush sometimes.
What would you say are some of the, like, just a couple narrative elements that get you from page 1 to 2, 3 in a story?
It can be totally different. You know, there are stories where absolutely nothing happens and it's just about voice. And if that voice is strong enough, that's fine. And there can be stories which are almost entirely plot. And if that plot is strong enough, that's great. But yeah, I mean, most of them are in between.
Yeah.
Those two things.
Anybody else? Yes.
So you said that you haven't been able to read fiction on your own in years or something?
Very little. Occasionally, you know, I judge fellowships or prizes, and then I'll read a novel where I'm not thinking, can I excerpt from this? But no, I haven't.
What do you do for an escape? Do you read People magazine? Or you know, what you have to read, or you know, stories to your kids. What else do you read?
Yeah, what does
On your own?
escape mean? I don't read on my own. That's my whole point. Yeah, I mean, I read the Times. I do read stories to my kids. That's been fun. That's actually been interesting, sort of rediscovering books I loved as a kid and seeing how, you know, the awfulness that was included in them, which I didn't notice as a child, you know, the sort of inherent racism of books that were written in the 50s or whatever. You know, it's interesting. That's been a...
No, I think, and you know, I had the same experience both in magazine work and in publishing. You don't read for pleasure. You just don't. And now I'm back to it a little bit, and it's hard. It's hard to get back into the pure, sort of somewhat passive enjoyment of stuff that you're not judging. It's a different frame of mind. And I sympathize with anyone who's still doing it, because one of the reasons you get to do what Deborah does is that you love to read and have always done so. And then you don't lose it, but it becomes a profession rather than a passion.
It's work at the same time. Yeah.
Yes.
Do you take work home? Do you take stories home?
Oh, of course.
Oh, yeah. I don't read in the office. I mean, that's the reading all happens at home, really.
That's a big change, because I mean, that is a difference. We used to
There's
be
just too
able
much going on in the office. I mean,
Yeah.
there's so much in terms of just the editing and the administration and the website and everything else. There's meetings. There's just too much. I very rarely can read for an extended period in the office.
I don't know. Let's take maybe 2 more questions, and is that about right, Kathy? Yeah. Yes, way back there.
When you talked about cutting the last paragraph, is it because you're thinking that you really want your readers to be outraged, or wanting more, like to leave them hungry, and not so satisfied that everything's tied up?
I rarely want a reader to be outraged or hungry. No, I want the experience of a story to be complete. And you know, that comes up. But I think what I mean, it's Dan who cuts last paragraphs anyway, not me. But I think what he was getting at
to it a little bit.
I think what he was getting at was the idea that a writer's impulse is often to say things that don't need to be said, that are already implicit in the story, and to sort of overstate or to repeat what's already been done.
It's interesting. When Brett Johnston was here, we talked about the idea of aboutness, whether a story is really about something or not. And he steadfastly maintains that it's more like an object, that it's really not about immigration in the case of, how do you say that name?
Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie.
It's not really about Middle East war in the Will Macken. It's not really about adultery in the Jabvala. That these stories are not about anything, he says. They are simply objects of art, and they leave the reader to sort of contemplate the way people are and how they act. And I think, to address further the question of cutting endings, it used to be that writers didn't trust that their object was complete when it was, and they wanted to put a little extra filigree on it or explain to you. And I always disagreed, and to this day disagree with the idea that New Yorker endings are inconclusive. I think they are very conclusive, but they're conclusive in a way that is not a hammer over the head, where you actually are left to think. And the Bronstein in particular is a story whose ending is very interesting.
It's a very delicate ending.
And
That one
ve-
had to be so
I'm not surprised to hear this.
carefully done.
It's enormously thought-provoking and emotionally powerful, and I admire the work that was done on it. One more. Yes, right here.
I'm curious about the covers and who the editor is. It seems like they're often timely, such as 211. All of a sudden,
Right.
somebody had to come up with an image.
Yeah. The editor for covers is Françoise Mouly. Yes, she's very good at eliciting immediate responses to news.
Is there a slush pile for that?
Yeah, she has there are a lot of artists who I'm sure just do their ideal New Yorker cover. Yeah, she's fielding a lot of things, and often she'll ask 2 or 3 different artists to tackle something, and only one of those will end up being used.
I think we should probably wrap up. I think it's probably time. I will say, just to be annoying, that the covers of the New Yorker are the one
Do you
kind
have a
of
complaint?
cranky complaint
Oh,
that
one.
I have.
One. That's about number 10.
No. I have no others, except for a few. But you are a sitting duck. The magazine is a sitting duck because of its excellence and primacy, and the fiction is often a sitting duck because responses to it are so emotional and so subjective. So it's not the easiest job in the world, but I have to say, it's still wonderful stuff. And I thank you very much for taking the time to come out here.
Thank you.